Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to A Cultural History of Canada. My name is Patrick, and with me, as always, is my co-host, Mackenzie. How are you, Mac?
I am good.
So,
This is
Mac,
nice weather we have today.
and other British Canadian niceties. Would you like a cucumber sandwich?
Oh, that's wonderful. May I have a glass of tea?
Excuse me, a glass of tea? What kind of barbarian are you?
I'm sorry, my AI learning program has not compounded that information yet.
So, Mac, the last Pop
Hello.
Canada. Please don't. I will shoot myself in the face.
I want to say that this is the future of Historia Canadiana. At one point, or Cultural History of Canada, whatever. At one point, we're just going to get AI to make the episodes for us. So it's going to sound like that.
Just put 150 episodes into an AI and just say, imitate a conversation between the two of us on this topic.
I kind of want to do that now.
I'm so curious. I've been fucking around and not for just to see the progress of it. Because I saw it. Did you see actually that more AI poetry has been accepted by journals than human poetry in the last couple of months? Right?
That's not disturbing.
No, because basically what happens is that editors like the clarity and straightforwardness of the AI poems, right? And they automatically think that the hyper complex and abstract poems that humans tend to generate in the modern era are AI because it's overly complicated, right? Too forcefully so, right? So yeah, I kind of made the test. I took one of my own poems and just kind of put it through an AI and said edit this and see what it works. It sucks. I hate it so much. It gives the blandest poems. It's technically a good poem. It fits meter. It fits meter and rhyme, but that's about it.
Well, there's a really interesting, because you know about dead internet, right? The dead internet theory.
Yeah.
And we're getting closer and closer to that point now, which basically it states that the more AI is in there, eventually AI is only really going to be talking to itself.
Yeah.
And so the AI generated, because AI is based on taking a bunch of human responses or what it believes to be human responses to generate a response, but it's only going to be taking in other AI, so it's just going to kill itself.
Yeah. I mean, good. The internet was a mistake, so whatever.
So was the gas engine, steam engine.
Yep. All reject
Honestly,
modernity.
The Amish were right. I'm just going to say it. The Amish were right.
Maybe less for the religious part, but the rejecting modernity part, 10 out of 10, no notes.
Yeah, the no cars or anything, that's great.
Yeah,
The social religious part, not so.
Yeah. Anyway, now that we've established our anti-modernity sentiments, let's get into
Let's talk about
discussion.
women.
Exactly.
Remember, women, reject modernity. Your right to vote is your husband's right to vote.
Good segue, because a few weeks ago, we recorded an episode on The Handmaid's Tale for our sister show, Pop Canada, which you can, get by supporting us on Patreon. Smooth transition.
It was a pretty fun episode, too.
It was, albeit a dark subject matter, but a fun episode.
Especially given recent elections in our pants.
Yeah, but that's the thing.
Recent developments in our pants.
Is that we recorded that episode before the election. Right, before the American election, or just before. So there's a tinge of hope in that episode, right? That the American people would do the right thing.
Really poorly.
Yeah, immediately. 2 days later, it aged. Curdled milk.
Whatever, that's fine. It's fine. We live in a society.
But it is interesting that these questions. Depressing that these questions are still at the forefront, but interesting nonetheless, because it will also make the topic for today's episode particularly relevant, right? Because the core question for today's episode, as it was understood in 1930 and in the 1920s in Canada, is basically, are women people? Obviously, the answer is yes, because we live in 2024.
Woman, your body, my choice, forever.
Shut up. Never say that again. I will slap you, even as a joke.
Do you know what happened to that guy who tweeted that?
No.
He got doxxed immediately because he was talking so much shit. And then he made out a tweet of guys, just leave me alone. I'm just trying to blah, blah, really pathetic. And then Andrew Tate responds. And Andrew Tate, you want to know what Andrew Tate responds? Your body, my choice forever. And apparently this man went to go cry and live with his mommy, and all the women are like, so you get lambasted by a bunch of women, and then you go run to your mommy.
All these people want is just a mom. That's it. But yeah, no, like basically the question that was posed in the 1920s and 30s, which we're going to be talking about, culminated in what in Canada is known as the Persons case. So we're going to kind of talk about that today and make some cultural relations to it. But it is kind of fascinating that that question, right, is pretty much still around and is at the core of this whole debate that was central to this recent election, right? With women's bodily choices and bodily autonomy, right? It is at the core a question about personhood, right? And what exactly that entails and who is entitled to it, which is, yeah, just depressing, right? So, you know, it is 100-year-old topic, but at the same time, a very current topic, much like Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. There you go. I made it all connect back because we can't make a single episode without talking about Maggie Atwood. So there you go.
Yeah.
Had you actually heard of this case before we talked about it today? Like, is this something that you were broadly familiar with, or?
Patrick, I've barely heard of men's history in Canada. What the fuck makes you think I would ever be taught women's history in Canada?
Yeah, fair. That's brutally insightful. Say that.
Like,
Yeah.
I'm just saying.
Yep.
The only taught like this, if this woman wasn't a celebrity or a singer, never heard of her.
Yeah. You know 3 women in Canada. One of them's your mom.
The other's my sister.
The other one's Kimmy. Okay, so basically we've already had, speaking of Kimmy, we've already had her on the show to talk about like early suffrage movements in Canada, right? Which, you know, has had basically a history since forever, but really solidified itself in the, you know, late 18th century and early 19th century, and was starting to pick up steam as it was in Europe, and eventually culminated in, at least for the first wave of feminists, into the right to vote in most parts of Canada, right? So, you know, looking at you, Quebec, which we're going to have a whole episode on, but most parts of Canada, women had the right to vote by 1920, more or less, right? Did I tell you I actually passed through the hometown of the prime minister that instituted federal right to vote for women? Yeah.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. It was kind of fun. Sir Robert Borden. Yeah.
Yeah.
So just because women have the right to vote in Canada by 1920, or a federal franchise and mostly provincial franchise, does not mean that like problems are solved. Shockingly enough. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
That's not how it works, unfortunately.
Yeah, exactly. Like, obviously it's a huge step and it's great, but also just because some women have the right to vote doesn't mean that every woman has the right to vote. You know, there's a whole history of racialized women being excluded from this. And it doesn't necessarily mean that women have access to the positions that they are voting on either. So, for example, and this is the subject mostly of today's episode, the Senate was a part of the federal government, and actually the only part of the federal government by 1920, to which women did not on paper have the same access to as men, right? On paper, I say, because technically women had access to other parts of the federal government and as many parts of the federal government as men did. But in reality, that often was not the case because social stigmas and, you know, social mores often stopped women from actually achieving those positions, right? So that's, you know, a fact of life that still follows people to this day. But the Senate was actively one of those institutions that were like, no, women, I'm sorry, you cannot be a senator, which is a bit of a weird thing.
It's not when you realize that the Senate actually has the most power in any judicial branch.
Even in Canada?
Oh, God, yes.
Today, like it's not really used, though.
They just don't want you to think it's used. Okay. At the end of the day, whatever gets through the House has to get cleared by the Senate, right?
True, but it's very rare that they use their power to bring down a law, though.
Yeah, it's rare, but they still have that power. And if the thing is, you never hear about senators. You'll hear about congressmen, you'll hear about members of the House, you'll hear about them all the time.
Mhm.
You'll hear about the guys above the Senate, your prime ministers, your presidents.
Yeah,
But the Senate is the most like low risk, high reward job you can get in government.
that's true. And it's an appointment for life, isn't it?
It might have used to be. I think now it's a. I
It's
don't know.
capped
It
off
might be
at
an appointment for
75.
life.
Yeah.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, I keep hearing discussions about it being capped off at some point. I'm not sure if it actually passed or not, but you're there for a bit.
No.
That's for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the Senate is essentially like, then that's the way they want it. They want you not to talk about the Senate because they don't want you to realize that the Senate actually holds a fair amount of power.
Mhm. Yeah.
Less so in Canada, other countries more for sure. The US,
Yeah.
for example, the Senate is one of the driving most powerful political forces.
Yes, exactly.
Them
It's
and
one of
the
those.
Supreme Court.
It's one of those things also where I just realized that my gain was way up. Sorry for folks who are listening to that. Sorry. But yeah, it's probably one of those forces because of the length of time that senators can actually be appointed. It's probably like inherently quite conservative because people are there for like decades, quite literally at some time, especially in the 1920s. So it wouldn't have been necessarily out of the ordinary for some very old men who had been appointed under previous governments to still be in power and want to hold on to that power in the way that you're talking
100%.
about. Yeah.
And again, there's a concept that the Senate is older, more dignified, enshrined form of government. You know, it's the one of the ruling class families or whatever. It's a lot of because senators a lot of time is like a family job. It's old names, old money that becomes senators. It's the same like last names.
Yes.
Whereas your House of
Surprisingly
Parliament
true
is
with a lot
allowed
of
to.
parties, to be fair.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. Like this isn't me taking shots at any particular party. This is like the system itself.
Yeah.
And this goes back to Roman Republic when they created the Senate in the first place. The Senate was supposed to be the aristocrats taking their turn, and that was going to be where they kept the power. And then the Congress, House of Commons, whatever. I don't remember what they call it in ancient Rome.
But yeah, I know
But that was that was the place of the common people. So it makes sense that like white men don't want to give that up because in their mind it's probably the last bastion of them still having all the power that they can.
Yep. So it's just one of those institutions, and you're probably right with like the traditional part of it is not just in the people themselves, but in the very foundations of it, not just the Roman time, but you can think of it in the specifically Canadian context. It's probably one of those things that people archaically associate with like the British heritage. And so a lot of people wouldn't necessarily want to get rid of it, much like people make the argument of not getting rid of monarchy, for example, or breaking with the monarchy. So there's probably connections with that as well, which intensifies its inherent conservatism, right? So basically, this was the situation for the Senate at this point. And there was pushback, obviously, from women's groups. And there were too many to name, but that sought through the vote to bring about social change and, very much pushed through attempted legislation or petitions or pressure groups to actually have women have at least technical access to places like the Senate, right? And continue their campaigns on an actual political level that, as you rightfully pointed out, they would have genuine power. So this is something that went back and forth. There's actually two prime ministers that straight up claimed that women were not among those eligible persons that were defined under the British North America Act. Because we have to remember that at the time, women had no legal identity or independent legal identity, right? They had one insofar as they were wives or mothers, but not like a formal person, like a property owner, for example.
They were they were codependent on their owners, their husband. Sorry,
exactly.
Slip of the tongue.
Yeah. But as society kind of changed faster than the laws and legislations, right? Obviously, it sucks, but the British North America Act was written in the 19th century when this wouldn't have been a consideration for the legislators who were actually writing it. So they didn't put it into the law. But, society had progressed a little bit by the 1920s, enough that people were like, okay, well, this is outdated, right? This is outdated language, even for our time. But actually changing something like the British North America Act not only takes time, but it takes a lot of effort and it takes a lot of political will, which by the very definition that you're not a part of the political system makes it very hard to institute that political will outside of,
Yeah.
It's a vicious circle. That's
I was talking a
still
lot
simple.
about this with some of my kids. They're learning about the Frontier Wars, which in Australia is like the Australian version of what Canada did to Indigenous people.
Okay. Yeah. It's
And
like an
so,
Australian Manifest Destiny type of thing.
yeah, exactly. And the whole anyway, so I was teaching these kids a lot of time about the system and trying to explain to them like you to affect change, you need to be part of it, which is why they focus so much on things like segregation, separation. Because if you're removed, you can't actively participate in that system.
But at the same time, what you see throughout history is that the people who can most effectively put pressure on the system are also the ones that are outside of it. Because once you're a part of the system, it becomes very difficult to change the actual workings of it.
Well, I think it's a bit of both.
Yeah.
It's a
Yeah.
balance. You can't throw stones at a glass house.
I mean,
forever.
It's not a good idea necessarily, but you physically can.
Yeah.
But this is mostly context. One of the people that I want to focus on for this episode is a person that we've actually talked about in that previous episode on the suffrage movement or early suffrage movement in Canada. Do you remember the name of Emily Murphy? Or not at all?
No.
Okay. She's actually quite relevant to this podcast because she was both a suffragette and feminist, early feminist, but she was also a writer in her own right. She wrote pieces of journalism, but also fiction like The Impressions of Janie Canuck Abroad and a whole series of Janie Canuck novels, which were basically a way for her to inhabit the Janie Canuck character and give her impressions of various places, both in Canada and internationally. So Janie Canuck kind of became a mouthpiece for Emily Murphy herself. And she would write basically a bunch of novels through that perspective throughout the early 20th century. And most of them are kind of fun, right? They became kind of bestsellers for the time and are kind of forgotten today, mostly just in association with Emily Murphy herself and rather on their literary merits because they're mostly young adult fiction type of books. And those don't tend to stand the test of time. But, they are quite interesting to reread in hindsight because they do show a lot of how Canada was developing, especially in the West, right? A surprisingly multicultural perspective in some of them, especially with the German and other Eastern European, communities that were in those places like Western Canada. So if you want like a more positive impression of Murphy, you can look at books like Janie Canuck in the West or Open Trails or Seeds of the Pine. All of that is great. But in classic like 1920s fashion, she was also a racist. So that also shines through in some of her books. Like The Black Candle, which is a thoroughly anti-Chinese immigrant book, which again, the more things change, the more they stay the same as far as blaming immigrants for some things. And specifically The Black Candle takes aim at Chinese immigrants.
We love blaming immigrants. We love never taking responsibility or accountability.
No, exactly. But in this case, the book takes focus on the Chinese migrants for the drug trade that was developing in Canada. So really, really doing a great job there, Emily. But yeah, that's not to discount some of the important work that she was doing for white women. There's no other way about it. White women in Canada at that time, because she would not have been concerned with Black women or obviously Chinese women or anything like that. Like she was undeniably racist, but that's not to say that she didn't do some positives. And she's pretty much the central hero of this specific story. But it is kind of interesting. Do you remember? I think we talked about this a little bit with the suffrage episode. Do you remember why people who were ostensibly progressive, like these early feminists, were so ready to jump on the bandwagon of things like eugenics and racism? Like, do you remember us talking about that?
Oh, yeah, very briefly. It wasn't brief, but I remember touching on it. It was like, oh, damn. It was something like, it was a warped sense of logic insofar that because they still had their Christian values, didn't they?
Yeah.
And I think that was part of it. Yeah. And so there was this belief that if they they had to protect their own rights as white women.
Yeah.
Something.
Yeah, it's pretty much it. So it's like not only, do you have a sense of like, well, the progressivism is taken almost literally, right? Where
Mhm.
you have this ingrained sense that white civilization is the peak of civilization, right? Which is
Yeah.
inherited from obviously British imperialism and other forms of imperialism that Canada kind of adopted. But also there's this idea that from a lot of, ostensibly progressive people at the time that like, well, if I worked so hard to get where I am, you should also have to work in your own right to work where you are.
Yeah.
And so,
It's basically the idea of the sisterhood isn't real.
exactly, at least at this time, it certainly isn't,
Yeah.
right? That's not to say that there weren't people, like obviously not everyone was racist at the time. Like that's just
Mhm.
factually incorrect. But um it this idea of sisterhood that you're bringing up would definitely develop a little bit more profoundly later, and even then it was never full. Right. So it's an unfortunate part of that history, but one that has to be acknowledged and reckoned. Right.
Mhm.
So Murphy herself, like despite her sketchy, some of the sketchier elements of her history, she did actually serve as various government functions. She campaigned for legislation to protect the wife's share of the husband's property should something happen to him or should something happen to the marriage. So this in
Mhm.
Alberta is known as the Dower Act. I think that's how it's pronounced, Dower Act, which was released in 1911. It's not perfect. It's not necessarily what women have as protection today, but it's a really interesting first step. And personally, I was genuinely surprised that it arrived that early in Canadian history. I would have thought that such protections would have come a little bit later in the 20th century. But, great, I guess, that in
Great.
1911 there were
Cool.
already some protections for that.
Mhm.
Um, and basically, for the next 7 years after pushing for such legislation, she would serve in various women's rights groups, right? So the Canadian Women's Press Club, and she was the president of that. And so through that club, she would pursue reforms on behalf of women, including suffrage, as well as other rights, such as being able to hold office in various positions, right? So very institutionalized forms of rights.
Mhm.
Um, and actually, she is a first as far as the entire British Empire is concerned, which good for her, I guess, because in 1916, which was the same year that women's suffrage was achieved in Alberta specifically, she would also become the first woman magistrate in the entire British Empire. So
Ah,
that's a Canadian first, I guess. I don't know if you have anything to say about that, but that's cool. I
that's
guess.
cool. I love that.
I'm here for the analysis. Stay for the jokes. But like, what does strike me as surprising, but certainly ironic, is that the very first day of her appointment as magistrate, what do you think happened to Emily Murphy? So she starts off the job, first woman magistrate in the British Empire. What do you think
She got
happened?
told that she's not a real magistrate.
Hell yeah, basically.
I don't accept this.
Yeah,
This is fake news.
that's it, not in those terms, but that's pretty much what happened. She was challenged by a lawyer on her very first day as a judge because, to quote this lawyer, they claimed that she was not a person and therefore not qualified to actually be a judge in the eyes of the law. So that's not a fantastic position for that lawyer, but it actually didn't go anywhere as far as I know. Like she did manage to get her motion through, and she did serve a career as magistrate. But it just goes to show that like almost immediately there was pushback to this idea. Right? So
That's great. We
women,
love that.
yeah, exactly. Women's group, however, women's groups across the country did, however, continue to like push for her specifically as a Senate candidate. Um, and what's kind of interesting is that the government at the time, uh, which would have been Borden's government, actually, argued that it would like nothing better than to have women in the Senate. But I'm sorry, the British North American Act had just made no provision for women. so if it's not written in the British North American Act, I can't do anything about it. And that was basically the government's position on the matter. It was like, well, the BNA Act is law, so sorry, bye. Just left. So
See ya.
yeah, exactly. What are you gonna do about it, loser? Was basically their position. So not a great look once again. I don't know if you had anything to add about this so far, but that's pretty much where we're at going into this.
It's never ending, isn't it? The struggle is never ending. The struggle doesn't stop struggling.
So it is shocking how that specific argument comes back over and over again in various contexts. Like you have this, if we want to take the obvious example of the United States, there's people who take the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution as fact, right?
The
like
right to bear arms.
Yeah, but like unmovable, pure fact, right?
Yeah.
Thereby ignoring any of the amendments. But like the idea that this is a
It
pure
cannot
and
change.
untouchable
It shall
document.
be the same forever.
Yeah, exactly. Which is a bizarre
It's
position
stupid.
to have. Yeah.
Incredibly so.
It's just one of those things that betrays a sense of how society functions. Like that's never how anything happened. Right? Like the document itself had to come from somewhere. Why would that be the ultimate end all be all? I never understood that position. Yeah.
People need a god. And in the modern day, it's getting harder and harder for these people to believe in like the old god, so they're making their new one. And their
That's
new
a really
ones,
good position. Yeah.
Their new gods are the founding fathers. Their new god is Donald Trump.
Oh,
Because it's getting harder and harder to believe and connect with a figure from thousands of years ago. So they have to find something new.
Yeah. I mean, it's the God is dead thing all over again.
Yeah. And God is dying even for the Christian. That's why. And again, you see the people, like the Christians who have actually really sort of thrived in their faith and belief are the ones that have sort of found a way to like mold the ideas of evolution and so on with the ideas of God. Like people who have sort of put the two together, they seem to be the ones that are doing the best right now.
No, exactly. But again, it comes back to the impossibility of rigid forms of conservatism in the modern era, right? Like I get it. Like
people always need something to believe in.
Yeah, exactly. But that only goes so far, and it quite literally, the world is too dynamic as it stands today to enable that kind of perspective in the face of the world. Right, that often was set up quite deliberately by those same people who are railing against it. Right?
Yeah,
it's a catch-22, but I like that idea that like the Constitution as a replacement God type of. Yeah, that's good to think about. It's at least a better idea than the AI images of Trump as Jesus, which is the most cursed thing that I've seen in a while.
I mean, again, like for all their talk to these people, MAGA, whatever, in human society, we just don't like change. We want other people to change, but we don't want to have to change ourselves, you know? It's the catch-22 of it. It's like, oh, I want change from the other people. I just want to keep doing what I'm doing.
Exactly. It's up to other people to adapt to me.
Yeah, so that promise of stability of like, oh no, the Constitution doesn't change. It's the Constitution, baby. It's very comforting.
Yeah. Which again, like the founding fathers themselves that you're supposedly holding up as gods or godlike figures, right? And again, this is true.
They admitted it needed to change. They admitted it, didn't it? Like there's provisions in there saying like, oh, this will not reflect the times that we live in, therefore.
And this is true in the Canadian context as well. We're taking the American example because it's an easy one here, but like this is true in the Canadian context as well, 100%. It was never, ever meant to be a stable, fixed document, right? At best, it was a foundation, but never just like this ingrained thing. Anyway, so this is where Murphy was operating in. And you know, obviously for the sake of narrative, we're focusing on one particular person, but again, I cannot emphasize just how much she was supported by, you know, groups of feminists and people across Canada who wanted this change actively, right? Yeah. She became kind of a figurehead in this very specific case, but, you know, women's groups and, you know, there are other prominent activists like Henrietta Edwards and Nellie McClung and Irene Parlby who did actively know Judge Murphy and actively worked with her in order to persuade the government to basically direct the Supreme Court of Canada to rule on whether women were indeed persons, because this was a huge hurdle for people in Canada.
This was an actual debate.
Like, and I get it. It's ridiculous now to think about it, but you have to talk about those questions at some point. And apparently in Canada, we decided to talk about it in the 1920s.
No, and it's true. Like you need to make sure, like, otherwise it's a failure of understanding your constitution.
Yes, exactly. It's kind of funny that it takes so long sometimes to have these discussions within a society, because, like, isn't that a foundational part of Mary Wollstonecraft's, like, the right vindication of the rights of women is like, we're people, like, fundamentally we're people.
Hey man, we're people too.
Like, that was like 200 years before the events of what we're talking about today. Oh God. So anyway, great stuff. So at first, it was pretty standard stuff to encourage the Supreme Court to rule on women's personhood. So, sending petitions to the Canadian government regarding interpretations of the word person. And specifically, the petition that was sent by the group of five, or the famous five, sorry, was one that asked the Supreme Court to rule on two specific questions. One, is there actually the power within the Canadian government, like the Governor General or the Parliament of Canada, to actually appoint a female to the Senate of Canada? So, like, can you actually do it, right?
Yeah, which is an important question to ask.
And number two, is it actually possible for the Parliament of Canada under the BNA Act to make provisions for the appointment of women to the Senate, right? So basically, if women are not included, can you actually make it happen? So those are the two fundamental questions that were being. And what do you think the Supreme Court ruled? If you had to guess, you get this petition saying, are we allowed to enter? If not, why not? Is basically the question. And would you think the Supreme Court said yes or no?
God, I'd want to hope they said yes for once.
Is that your final decision?
Did they say no?
They said no, unanimously. Not even like one dissenting voice, just unanimously, nope. Sorry, not sorry. You'll have to try again next time.
But
obviously, women are considered people in the eyes of the law, so it didn't end there, right?
And thankfully, we're still incredibly tied to England, aren't we?
Exactly. So despite being called the Supreme Court, it's 1928, baby. There's no such thing as the Westminster Treaty that separates Canada quite thoroughly from Britain. So there's something beyond the Supreme Court.
Big Daddy England is stepping in, baby.
Let's go.
The one-time imperialism helped the movement.
But again, in pure imperialist fashion, it helps a very specific group of women 100 years after they needed help.
God.
And then they took the credit for it. Laughing about it, but like it's classic, right? Like, oh, we're actively removing these rights for people, and then 100 years later, we're presenting ourselves as hero for actually giving you those rights.
It's the same way that fucking capitalism is now creating renewable energy futures. It's fucking... Oh, it hurts my head. It genuinely just hurts my head.
Don't you just love it?
Don't you just love the crushing sense that you should give up?
Don't you just love the crushing knowledge that you're actively being gaslit by every aspect of society into thinking that everything is okay and that we're doing everything that's possible for you in this very specific moment, even though that's a lie? I love it. I don't know. So basically, the Supreme Court said no, like I said, in 1928, because of basically the interpretation that we were talking about earlier, that the BNA Act had to be interpreted in the same way in 1928 as in 1867 when it was passed. You can't change that.
Yeah.
And so women's groups were obviously like, well, that's bullshit. That makes no and appealed to the higher authority in this case, which, like you said, is in England. And specifically, it's known as the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, which is based in London, of course. And the court went for quite a bit of time, and specifically, it ended on October 18th, 1929, when the final appeals to the court took place and ruled in the women's favor in Canada. And specifically, Lord Sankey delivered the judgment on behalf of the Privy Council, remarked specifically that, quote, the exclusion of women from all public offices is a relic of days more barbarous than ours. And to those who ask why the word persons should include females, the obvious answer is, why should it not? Which, yes, that's exactly true. Why should it
If
not?
only you said that 100 years ago. If only you said that. Fucking
Only you had been alive.
I get it.
Lawrence.
Like, I get it. We're not like we change. We're allowed to change. But it's like, guys, stop pretending like you're heroes in this situation.
Yeah, especially like this is something we talked about when we first talked about women's rights. It's like these are things that were fact in the early days of the Canadian.
It's one thing
project.
to like. Well, it's one thing to turn around and admit the fact that you're wrong. That's good.
Yes.
Admitting you're wrong is always welcome. It's another thing to turn around and celebrate it and be like, "Oh, I did the right thing right now.
Yeah,
I'm
exactly.
he for she.
Yes,
I'm an ally." And it's like, no, you admitted you're wrong, and that's great. Keep doing that. Now you are not the important part of this conversation.
Exactly.
You still aren't.
Yeah, I find the use of his term barbarous to be quite insightful, though, because who in Canadian society in the 1920s and 30s is not considered a person or not allowed to hold office. And it's basically literally everyone else who's not a white property owning person, right? Like even if women are now included, it's, I can't emphasize this enough. It's still white women. And again, great, but the use of the term barbarous pulls a lot of weight here, where we still have to contend with the fact that the British Empire is very much a thing, and they have very specific people in mind when they refer to barbarous people. Because again, literally every non-white population. And that says a lot about whether or not they deserve rights as women or as citizens of a particular country. So yeah, sorry, you look like you were going to say something.
No. It's
okay.
It's all good.
All right.
Trample my voice. It's fine.
Okay. So last few things, and then we're going to touch upon like some cultural reflections.
Artifacts.
On this. Yeah, exactly. It is quite worthy of note. Like we make a joke about like it took a long time for this to take place, which yes, but in the grand scheme of things, when we consider that the Canadian state as we know it emerged in 1867 and that by 1929, women were able to hold political office at all spheres of the federal government, it's pretty impressive that in the span of 60 years, you went from zero to that, right?
Yeah.
It's not perfect,
good,
but it is quite good at the end of the day. It's like, okay, well, you did something. And the people who actively advocated... And, the women who actively advocated for this deserve credit where it's due, right? Their racism notwithstanding, that actively took away the rights of other women to do that is another issue, but it's something.
Hey, how do you eat an elephant?
Yes.
One bite at a time.
Right.
It's the same thing here.
Yeah. And obviously there were still two exceptions. Like in Quebec, women still didn't have the right to vote by the time this passed, right? There would still be another 10 years before the Person's case, until after the Person's case.
Quebec.
And New Brunswick as well. New Brunswick women could vote, but they could not hold political office. So by definition, they could only vote against their own interests. Gotta love those French people.
Francophone.
I'm joking. I love you, New Brunswick. Quebec sometimes. So basically, as a kind of cap off here, the Person's case became symbolic of women's legal equality. Ultimately, Judge Murphy, funny enough, she made this whole push to be accepted into the Senate and was never appointed to the Senate. So I guess that's a bit disappointing in that sense, but it did pave the way for other women to be appointed, so that's great. And it wasn't exactly then to be an effective platform for feminist reform at the end of the day, right? Like, kind of like we mentioned at the start of the episode, a lot of changes to women's rights in Canada happened outside of the House of Commons or outside of the Senate, through protests or through activism and so on. And despite the fact that the Senate itself was not that effective where feminism was concerned, it is still significant as a case, as a victory that was achieved by women through the machinery of an existing system. So great. Like, yeah, it's kind of like that thing in Charlie Chaplin. Did you ever see Modern Times?
No.
You should. You should watch like the first 20 minutes of it. After that, it gets kind of repetitive. But the first 20 minutes are kind of fun, where Chaplin gets sucked into the machinery and by his and breaks it, right? And obviously he's talking about different thing than women's rights. He's talking about capitalism specifically, but it is indicative of a similar type of image that the person's case is, which is women's groups infiltrating the machinery itself in order to change it. And that's great. I endorse that. Change the machinery. Just tear it down. Maybe don't throw your body into it, but tear it down. It's good.
Yeah.
And it didn't take a very long time after the person's case passed that Irvine Wilson was sworn in as Canada's first female senator. So the person's case was concluded in October of 1929, and in February of 1930, Wilson was sworn in. So a couple of months later. So that's really great. And just on a fundamental vocabulary level, second wave feminists in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s maybe adopted the actual term of personhood as a symbol of women's legal equality. And like the whole question of personhood really became a central focus of a lot of second wave feminist discourse. So again, you can't quite underestimate this whole idea of are women persons or not. Like we made a joke about it, but it is fundamental to how women's groups would evolve and change for the decades after, right? And still to this day, again, with abortion rights, it is a person-centered issue. So yeah, anything you want to add to any of this before we talk a little bit about cultural reflection?
No, I think you've covered a lot of it. I know I'm not saying the most right now, but I think that's because, like, again, like you said, it's going to be a bit of a shorter episode just because it just is what it is, you know? It's just in the juxtaposition with today, like, the fight for progress is one of those constant things, you know?
Absolutely, right? And it is funny because when you were bringing up the my body, my choice thing, that's become such a set, like, it was co-opted by people who are completely antagonistic to women's rights, right? And even during the pandemic, it was co-opted by people who were against the vaccine. But again, that specific slogan of my body, my choice was a specifically feminist one from the 60s and 70s, right? They're the ones who started that with specific personhood goals in mind, right? And the fact that it's been so warped and co-opted by groups who are completely antagonistic, right, does show just how important these issues of bodily autonomy and personhood actually are. Obviously for women, but just in general as well. So
100%.
I don't know. I just wanted to end on that. I advocate for women, rights and bodily autonomy. 10 out of 10.
Yeah, just let them do what they want with their bodies, man.
Yeah, exactly. So just a quick thing here. We did not that long ago an episode on modernism, poetic modernism, right? Can you remind listeners what modernism is as an artistic movement, poetically speaking?
Yeah, so modernism isn't like the modern day. Modernism is referring actually to the turn of the 20th century.
Right.
And the movement is very much, what did I say at the time? I felt like I really nailed it on the head before.
Yeah, exactly.
but
trying to capture that lightning in the bottle again.
Yeah. But no, modernism is very much focused on the turn away from the old way of thinking, doing things into the more like machinery, the more society, like we live in a society, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. If ever we're not going to get into it, but like if ever you're wondering a term that can be very much associated with modernism, if you've ever heard the term futurism, that comes from that. And whatever that invokes in your mind as a term, it's probably closely associated to modernism, right? A lot of the themes that emerge in literary modernism are ones of making it new, embracing the future, right? Speed, technology often comes up, but also questioning your place in the universe. Like, what does it fundamentally be a person in time and place? So all of these kind of emerge in modernism. But what's kind of interesting,
baby.
what's kind of interesting in relation to this topic is that it emerged as a very masculine type of movement, often deliberately so. I bring up futurism. Futurism was quite fascist, right? And you brought up a lot of masculine associations with that because fascism is a very toxic movement. But even in its lesser forms, like not explicitly fascist forms, like we talked about it in our modernism episode, a lot of the main figures of the modernist scene in North America and Canada were explicitly quite masculine. Strong people, like strong men, right, who wanted to embrace the factory work type of thing, and farm hands, and embracing the future in strong and powerful male ways, right? Having a strong voice in that sense. And we're laughing about it now, and that's not to discount the fact that there's a lot of really good modernist poetry, but that is very much what happened. It's a very macho type of poetics for a lot of people, especially in the 1920s. And obviously that's a byproduct of the gender politics of the time. That's inevitable. But what's interesting is that a lot of modernist poetics did get some pushback by women writers in the Canadian scene who were explicitly modernist and trying to adopt all of that, but also saying your masculine perspective is also really bullshit. Like, you're not going to necessarily win us over on that front. So we've talked about Dorothy Livesay, for example, before. She's a fantastic poet, and so she's one of the people who would push back against this vision. But we have people like Margaret Avison and Miriam Waddington or Anne Wilkinson, who all emerge from that same modernist tradition at the same time. And you see this in their willingness to develop, right, what's called little magazines, which were basically pamphlets, like poetic pamphlets. What's it called? Chapbooks, right? They're basically like chapbooks for the 1920s, which would have small print runs and unconventional content with really unknown writers. And a lot of them were started by women, right? Because most of the readership for magazines, which were starting to emerge in like things like Chatelaine at the time, would have been women. And so they already had this like ingrained sense of the usage of magazine, but in this case, in order to push back against the highly masculine modern. And I think that's kind of a forgotten part of Canadian literary history, is that the actual fundamental way that these poetics are portrayed and disseminated is very feminine, at least at this time. And this is often something that's forgotten, like, for example, the novel. Right? I'm sure you know this, Mac. The novel was explicitly coded as a feminine medium, especially in its early days, right? So it's something that's seen throughout literary history, right? So yeah, I just took up two examples here by a poet that was based in Montreal. I think she's still alive. I'm not sure. Called P.K. Page, and she gives this really good example of the poetic vision that emerges in the 1920s and 30s. That's very much characterized by a fluidity of images that can be seen as feminine. Right? Did you read these poems?
Yeah, I did.
Do you want to read
them now?
Yeah, sure.
Which one do you prefer?
I don't know. Go with After Rain. Let's go with After Rain.
Got it. Nightmare.
Okay, great.
In the white bed, this too dark creature nests, litters her yelping young upon my breast. Dreams are the thicket. In them, wearing masks of my familiar faces, she dissembles. Trembles in every image, calls my falcon, which falls a feathered stone to her white wrist bone. Twists me like wire, stretches me tight and thin, a black skeleton stark among flowering apples. Or an appalling valentine of lace and hearts, hot and frilled, abandoned in the... Do I become at the dark bitter wish of this night-walking anxious alchemist? Sometimes she smiles at me, as if I were her own face, smiling in a mirror, and she rehearsing sweet looks in my eyes, of barley sugar and of butterflies. Yet should I sleep forever, she would eat my beating heart as if it were a plum. Did she not know with terrible wisdom, by doing so, she would devour her own? Very wonderful. Very pretty poem.
Yet it's called Nightmare.
Yeah. I don't know. I think I like that it starts, though, the idea that the dream for one is the nightmare for the other.
Okay. Yeah.
That's really good. Yeah. Thanks. I'm here with all the great poetic analysis.
Yeah, exactly. You who loves poetry.
Yeah. No,
But
but it's true, this idea that like sure. It's just interesting to me to look at. And I like the juxtaposition and the use of perspective in this, you know what I mean?
okay, what do you mean by perspective?
Well, like the perspective of one is basically one stream is the other's nightmare.
Okay, in
And this
that sense, yeah,
perspective
yeah,
of,
okay.
oh, if she's eating me, she's devouring herself, right?
Mm,
Now, I don't have too much context for what's happening right now. This
yeah,
two dark creature nests, litters are yelping young upon my breast. So I don't know if they're both supposed to be women, or
at
if
least,
one is a woman of color and another is a white woman.
yeah, it's unclear exactly of the specific identities, but I like that, especially in relation to what we were talking about with the racialization of certain women at the time.
Hmm.
I agree, like by doing so, she would devour her own. Of being
Yeah.
antagonistic towards specific groups
Well, I
is
think
is self-destructive at the end of the day, right? Not
if we
only
look at
for
this, if we look at the words,
yeah,
a black skeleton stark,
yeah,
a feathered stone to her white wrist bone.
yeah.
I honestly, I do think this is like the perspective of a white woman and then a woman of color. And the white woman is devouring the woman of color without realizing that she is hurting herself as well.
I think that's
That's
getting
my
onto
personal
something.
interpretation. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're getting onto something there.
Especially like this. Sometimes she smiles at me as if I were her own face smiling in a mirror. Because there's often that problem in, I mean, I don't want to be the one. I'm saying this as like a dude talking to another dude without a
Yeah,
woman
yeah,
on this podcast, which is a
mhm,
problem, but
sure.
there's a problem that I've seen and heard where you will have white women take to social media and be like, oh, the sisterhood,
Yeah.
staying with the sisterhood,
Hmm.
without knowing what that action will entail, or the second that it becomes inconvenient for them, turning their back on their so-called sisterhood.
It's a you're
And
you're
if
pointing to a criticism of white liberal feminism. Yeah.
yes, and it's the
Yeah,
same with boys in the Brotherhood.
absolutely. And it is interesting. Like this poem would have been written later than the context that we're specifically talking about in Canada, but PK Page would have been present in the original moment. And I
Mhm.
think you're right in saying that despite the poem being a little bit outside of the context of the original context, does get to at the heart of what underlies the person's
Mhm.
case and a lot of the people playing in it. But specifically in the modernist sense, I also want to add on like the use of specific words that are often associated with the feminine, right? Blooming fruit, for example, is a pretty obvious one, right?
Mm.
That's often used in relation to women and the vagina, or just women in general. But also, right, butterflies and barley sugar, like all these things that are stereotypically associated with women, but it's an inherently violent poem, as a lot of modernist poetics explicitly was. It was explicitly advocating for a form, not necessarily of like intense violence as in hitting someone, but violence that was being felt, or violence against nature, or violent change, right? Any kind of like vague violence that you can imagine, or most abstract sense. So that dichotomy between what is conventionally associated with the fairer sex, quote unquote, with this very dark, literally nightmarish poem is, I think, an interesting contrast that Page is getting at in this. That I think is one way that women would kind of push back against the violent masculine poetics of modern. I don't know if you agree with me on that one, but I thought that was kind of cool.
Mm.
Yeah. Do you want to read the other one? And we'll
Sure.
finish with that.
With the other one. After rain. The snails have made a garden of green lace. Broderie anglaise from this cabbage. Chantilly from the chou-fleur, tiny veil. I see already that I lift the blind upon a woman's bedroom of the mind. Such female whimsy floats about me like a kind of tulle, a flimsy mesh, while feet in gum boots pace the rectangles. Garden abstracted, geometry awash, an unknown theorem argued in green ink dropped in the Euclid in glorious chlorophyll half drunk. I none too sober, slipping in the mud, where rigged with guise of rain, the clothesline gauche as the rangy skeleton of some gaunt, delicate spidery meat, is pitched as if listening, while hung from the one thin rib a silver web. Its skeletal infant is similar in shape, now sagged with cold ellipsoid and glistening.
Good. I like the use of Euclid as an
Mm.
image here, right? This
Euclidean.
Yeah, but yeah, for people who don't know, right, Euclid was a Greek mathematician, right?
Wait, is that the end of the poem, or is there another page to it?
Nope, that's it. But it's called two poems, but there's another poem after, but it's a different poem.
Okay. Just trying to make sure.
Oh, no, sorry. I think it does
Yeah.
keep going.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I suffer shame in all these images. The garden is primeval. Giovanni in soggy denim squelches by my hub over his room. Shakes a diamond head, but he is so beautiful and demid. His long Italian hands so wrung with rain, I find his ache exists beyond my rim. Then almost weak to see a broken man had satisfied my whim. I'll choir him birds and let him come to rest within this beauty as one rests in love, till pears upon the bough encrusted with small snails as pale as pearls hang golden in a heart that tears are the half of love. Yeah, that's the end of it.
It's the unification of the right. You go from snail to snail. Yeah. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Obviously, you have like the imagery here again that kind of keeps going, but specifically that of nature, right? That is particularly important. You often see women associated with very specific images of nature throughout literary history, right? And throughout just semiotic history, if you want. And this option of that imagery of like the eco woman or this woman as nature, I think is particularly interesting in this poem, especially like I said, in relation to Euclid, right? This attempt by, in this case, a Greek man to mathematicize and categorize, what is implied to be a woman as nature in this very specific box, right? The mathematicization of it, I think, is quite interesting. I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add here, but I think it points to, again, this idea of wanting to break out from specific categorizations that are imposed on by tradition and myth.
Yeah. I like the valuation on the snails, small snails, pale as pearls, making the comparison between the two of them.
Yeah.
Sort of, again, showing a difference in perspective, shows a difference in valuations. You know what I'm saying?
Okay. Elaborate. Say more.
Say
what do you
more.
mean by valuations for people who might not be?
Well, again, if we're taking this look as a very gendered thing, the Giovanni and soggy denim squelches by my hub over his ruin, shakes a diamond head, but he's so beautiful and diademed, his long Italian. So again, he's very like, he has an old school value, but he doesn't seem to appreciate the value of this garden. And gardens are very much a gendered thing to have.
Yeah.
There's been entire books written about the idea of the secret garden for one, and their exploration and all that. And so the perspective shifting with this man who tries to come into the garden and just doesn't get it, does not understand like why there is value here. And again, such female whimsy floats about me like a kind of tool, flimsy mesh, while feet in gumboots pace the rectangles.
I like this the idea of whimsy. I remember a criticism.
Whimsy.
Yeah, but it's often been used against by especially women, but not exclusively. But like it's been used as a criticism, right? Oh, you're too whimsical. You're just kind of not taking things serious. But I think the use by Page here of the term whimsy and then showing that it's not actually the person who is identified as whimsical that's lacking seriousness or lacking understanding is, I think, a really powerful indicator, because you're right. The male figure in this is the one who's not taking the garden serious. But whimsy is often the term that we describe to someone who's not in that position. So I think it's a very deliberate term here by Page that accomplishes a very potent purpose. I just wanted to bring these two examples up. Right. I don't know if you had anything to add on either of them or on just any of the things that we've talked about today, but that's it. That's all I had. Okay. Mac, what can people do to support the show or help us in any way, shape, or form?
Well, obviously in this episode about women, it's also now about supporting the men. So,
yes, obviously. Yes.
To support the men of this show and the hard work that they do, you can support us on Patreon, paying in and getting exclusive ad-free episodes or things like Pop Canada. You can support us on PayPal, pay what you think we're worth, which might be nothing. That's fine. Spread us around. Word of mouth, always great. Leave a comment. Talk us up to your friends. Leave reviews. Leave hateful comments, hurtful comments. I like the pain. It makes me feel better. As long as I feel something, But other than that, just keep on listening, folks. Just keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you, everyone, for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Cheers.
Cheers.